said earlier and yesterday as well, we're not going to have any value to share if we don't create value. In Europe, as you know, better than most of us in the room, there has been the spectacular reality of having a shrinking economic pie. What are the lessons that Africa may learn from that pie that has been shrinking as we try and grow our own?
Well, that's a completely unprepared question, but I think
You spent 10 years at BCG.
I'll bounce right back on the theme that we've heard here. I think, you know, in Europe, we have the same problem, and we see it in the US, by the way, as well. This talent mismatch that you've been talking about between, you know, massive youth unemployment. We have some countries in Europe at 25% youth unemployment. Less severe where I come from in Switzerland, but you have that full spectrum, and you have the same in the US. At the same time, you have businesses who are not accessing the skill base that they need to actually grow their businesses, particularly in the new digital age, particularly in this very engineered-oriented world. So, you know, I think that's the recipe, and we've got, in Europe, we have, and Nestlé is actually one of the leading companies on that, organizing themselves again to drive apprenticeships throughout Europe, leveraging suppliers, leveraging other businesses, and say, what can we do as a collective body to close the mismatch? In the US, and actually FSG is part of that process, there's an initiative called the 100,000 Opportunity Youth Initiative. In fact, that group of some 50 companies, and there were Starbucks and Walmart have been some of the leading companies behind this. Rockefeller Foundation is involved, far exceeded already that target. What they're doing is exactly what, Sazini, what you described for Barclays, but taking 50 companies, doing it city by city across the US, engaging with local organizations to prepare youth for a massive career fair. All the companies show up city after city and try to close that gap. What they're realizing, of course, is you both have to move upstream in the educational process, but you also, and this is super important, as they've hired thousands of opportunity youth already, the critical piece is, are you ready in your organization to retain those youth? This is not the same, and so there's a whole process of actually learning, and again, there's funding from Walmart and Rockefeller to understand how do we improve our practices of retaining and growing these youth into careers within our businesses. And that's what it takes.
Sander, I want to stick with the big picture for the moment. I mean, if we look at the region, some countries do better than others. Do we know what sets the winners apart from the losers or the ones who are a bit more sluggish in terms of their growth trajectory?
Yeah, again, totally unprepared for that. Is Mike's on now? But I think I'll actually just pick up from your first question. I think one of the things that, you know, we look at most is what really is the difference between GDP-driven growth and societal growth, because the two are very different. And so GDP growth versus inclusive growth, because I think a lot of countries, you know, mine included in Kenya, that has recently been classified as a middle-income country, great, but we actually are probably doing neither. Our economy is not growing, neither are we growing on an inclusive path. So I think, you know, the terminologies that are used in macroeconomics are also slightly, I think, deceiving. But I think one of the key things, and it's interesting because we all sit here as probably large corporates, is ignoring, I think, the role that SMEs play in driving this growth. So the shared value approach, I know, focuses very much on what big business can do around society, but I also feel that SMEs play a really key role in driving innovation, creating jobs, and actually that's where, for me, the big growth opportunities lie. If I take Kenya, 1 million young people are ready to enter the workforce every year. Private sector, big corporates can actually only absorb less than 8% of that. So really, if you're to look at what can move our country forward, it's really looking at the role of the SME. And I'm really looking forward to the era when the shared value approach then really puts also SMEs front and center of what a growth trajectory is for countries. That really would be my take. I think it's, you know, we're probably at the stage where we really need to interrogate the role of the SME and where innovation and job creation actually really happens sustainably.
But I wonder if we're doing enough, Sazini, in that respect. I mean, I was saying this morning that, you know, it's going to be so important for corporate citizens to make sure that you are demonstrating factually and with evidence that you are indeed walking the talk. You're just not talking a new lingo. When it comes to SMMEs, there is a new lingo as well, and some companies, if we take South Africa as an example, are doing better than others, and quite frankly, some of them are paying lip service to us. And that's now the language of ED. And that was one of your columns in the critical slide that you had. When it comes to enterprise development, I've done many events where companies have had one or two samples of what they've done in terms of enterprise development, playing along their supply chain to try and do some upskilling, help them also access more clients that perhaps you as one of their clients are able to access with greater proximity than they can. But the truth of the matter is there's no systemic change that happens. Even ED sometimes become a gimmick. And you have 2 or 3 little guys from the township in the flagship ED program. But when we look at the macroeconomic data year in and year out, it is very clear that the much punted entrepreneurship that is supposed to be the multiplier effect in creating employment doesn't happen in South Africa. And it's also very clear that SMMEs are still struggling to break through and compete with the big corporates. What are your thoughts on the states of enterprise development, truly?
Truly?
Well, I must say I concur with you on many points. The challenge we have in South Africa with the SME development is a structural problem. I do believe that as large corporates, small businesses, and public sector, we do need to start looking at the structural formations we have around supporting and enabling small businesses to grow. It is a systemic problem, as you rightfully say, and I think the failure to address it is because it's very fragmented, highly tick box exercise linked to regulatory frameworks, versus looking at it from an inclusive growth perspective of how the SME sector is the engine of the growth of our economies. I challenge the notion that in South Africa we are not very entrepreneurial compared to other countries like Kenya would typically get those comparisons, and Nigeria. If you look at our informal sector, which I think the former president called the second economy, there's over 40+ billion that circulates within that economy, demonstrating that there's actually a lot of economic activity that is taking place there. So it takes me back to my first point that it's a structural challenge. And the need to address it requires to diffuse the tensions around public-private partnerships and start looking at the policy, implementation, and corporate contribution to the changes that are required to transform that sector.
Which I think, I want to come back because financial inclusion is another part of, I think, one of the stumbling blocks for unleashing the power of SMMEs in many of our countries. But Akiva, I want to come back to what you said about trust. And I think, when I listen to Maria talk about the possibility of public-private partnerships in terms of finding innovative, clean technologies, decentralizing the grid, that's obviously at a strategic level, one way in which to try and guarantee greater levels of energy security and hopefully also drive down the cost curve of producing energy and then selling it to us and to businesses, particularly to startups where it might be a big part of your input cost. But then we look at South Africa and we see that the biggest stumbling block to being able to implement what Maria is saying in policy terms and practically really comes down to leadership and to trust, which is something that you puzzle through. There's no trust in AISCOM. There is absolutely no trust in the government's commitment to creating PPPs. There is very little trust that we are going to make it easier for new players to enter the sector. How do we begin to problem solve for trust being low and for the leadership crises as two of the hurdles to doing the kinds of things that Maria was saying we could do if only trust and leadership were guaranteed?
That was for me.
Well, both of you can both jump in. Yeah.
Thank you for putting me in the middle of this storm. No, for sure, we entered South Africa. As you know now, we are really the first renewable operator in South Africa. But we are growing because we won a few tenders, and so we have to reach 1 gigawatt in renewables, but it's going to be delayed a little bit. So, of course, I'm not South African. I cannot discuss the decision to invest money in fossil fuels and nuclear apparently. But I think that, and that was what I was saying before, I think that this is an incredible opportunity we are facing. It's a huge challenge. But that's exactly what the role of corporation, civil society are for nowadays. I think that if we strongly believe that we need to change to better our world, and the Paris Agreement really put some strong commitments on how to lower the CO2 emissions, and we need to maintain that strong effort that also few activists coming from South Africa, for instance, did in that period. We need to work together. It's a great opportunity to, let's say, be stronger if civil society and cooperation, which are not enemies, because at the moment we want and we are fighting all together to reach the same goals, and most of all to reach those targets that the United Nations decided. We need to take commitments. So cooperation, and Enel was one of the first, took strong commitments for the SDGs, and we are measuring the level of our targets. But I think that each single person can take its own commitment on this, because we have also a personal responsibility. So the opportunity is to work together to push the decisions of public sector and institutions.
But Akiva, I want to bring you in here. I mean, I agree with Maria in part. Obviously, there are things we can do while waiting for the government to be the best possible government that we imagined ourselves that we are deserving, and we haven't yet experienced, arguably, as South Africans. But the truth of the matter is that the biggest stumbling blocks are at the level of quality boards at state-owned enterprises in terms of the leadership, having technocrats in charge of strategic parts of the economic cluster, and so one can dot the different parts of the political leadership challenge. How do we fundamentally deal with that? Because the truth of the matter is that even if what Maria is saying is feasible and desirable, it's going to mean nothing if you live in a country where the people in charge do not have the political will. And if there's perhaps one theme that's been on the margins of the summit so far, it is how central political risk and political will are to dealing with, for example, the energy crisis and then the knock-on effect it has on the macroeconomy.
So, look, I mean, the challenge I think we all face and we see all the time is again, they're great theories. I mean, I'm saying what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but the reality plays out very differently. And I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. And what we've seen is some of the experiments we've done, and I can give you one or two examples also overseas as well, which are really interesting, is when it comes to like these big issues, the problem we have, we often make these sweeping statements, right, and these big generalizations, which it ends up, it actually disenables leaders. So what we've seen is you've got to be very clear and conscious and aware of what actually drives a difference. In other words, if I want you to change, I want you to lead in a certain direction, I don't get here in a room of 50 or 100 people. And what we've seen is the big development agencies that used to do that in the past, they would waste literally in the billions of dollars investing into opportunities in Africa because they didn't engage in the right way. It was just too big. So the question is, how do you engage? How do you, you've got a great line, you say the future's already here, it's just unevenly displaced, right? So there are already future scenarios of people who get together in small groups, trusted circles, but you've got to have the right stakeholders in the room. I mean, if anyone want to check it out from a research point of view, go check out what Malaysia's been doing over the past few years. And that's really how you shift the conversation.
But how do you do that, Akiva? Let me put you on the spot.
So you
can have some value for your time here, because
100%.
some people do meet in small numbers, but if the wrong people meet in small numbers, the section wall should be, that's not going to help us either.
May I add something to this matter? Because yesterday, as you underlined, this morning, there was also a great discussion about communication. Me and Marc, we were in New York for the Shared Value Initiative Summit with Marc, and Marc at the very end said, we need all your support to change the narrative of the shared value. So, for instance, this is another tremendous opportunity. because we need the media to change. I'm talking about my sector, my industry, the one I know better for sure. So we need to demystify all the issues about renewable energy, for instance.
Sure.
And I think that the tremendous opportunity, again, are those totem at the corner. If we don't want to remain simple icons, but really act, taking into account, there are a lot of things written there. If we are considering fossil fuels generation, for instance, there is a target over there that is water capacity, water scarcity. So water is an issue in Africa. So how can we imagine to continue to plan carbon or coal plants that need a lot of water to be taken into operation, for instance? So I think that the media can really play a great role in changing the way the narration can be done through shared value. This is an opportunity, for instance.
No, I totally agree with you, and I think that's true. I think in the media we're often guilty of finding personality-driven stories more sexy to narrate than sticking with the issues. And when it comes to the triple challenge of water insecurity, energy insecurity, and food insecurity, you are unlikely to wake up and pick up the Business Day or the Star or the Sunday Times and have those themes on the front page, and yet they are probably as much of a political threat as some of the leaders happen to be. I wonder, we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left because unfortunately we have a packed program for you. But Sazini, I wanted to pick up on financial inclusion, and I'd like Sanda, you to jump in after Sazini on this one, and then Marc, I'll give you the final overall thought. Do you think South African banks are doing enough to help entrepreneurs be able to take their ideas to market and to take a chance in themselves? It's a grammatical pause, don't worry.
Tough questions to this section.
I would say the answer is we need to do more. And more from the sense that we need to start relooking at our traditional models of funding, to start looking at how we can enable and allow the more entrepreneurial millennials we're seeing coming forward who have an idea and have no collateral, but that idea can be the next Mark Zuckerberg idea, and start looking at it differently. And I think if I look at the banks and the financial services sector, we are the sector that has actually tried to drive an innovation approach. Most of the banks do have innovation hubs that they've established and set up. I think FNB has an alpha code that drives the entrepreneurial discussion and ecosystem. Absa, we've got the RISE Accelerator program in Cape Town that also drives the same conversation from an entrepreneurship perspective. But I do believe that we need to do more in terms of dealing with the general small business, a startup, and start looking at how we can develop a startup proposition that can enable small businesses to grow.
Okay. Sandra, your thoughts?
So I won't necessarily speak from the, obviously we're not a bank, it's FICOM, but I think my thoughts on financial inclusion would be that, there's a couple of things. I think as Africa, there's enough opportunities to really innovate around the area. I think there's lots of ideas. I think where we actually fall short is on how to partner better, and to have a conversation where we can all bring our different perspectives, values, and metrics to create a platform that actually works towards success. Because I think, as the lady from Barclays has said, banks and big business are doing their part, innovators and ideators are doing their part. There's certainly enough opportunities to create solutions. I just think we don't talk well enough together. And that's where things like the SDGs, I believe, create a really great common platform for the type of shared value conversation that we can have around it. So it's not for lack of resources or lack of ideas. I just think we need to talk and partner more. And I just want to touch very quickly on the leadership question because I think it's important. If we're going to talk about demystifying things, I think we need to demystify leadership as well. Leadership tends to be stuck as political or commercial leadership, whereas there's so many other models of leadership that are needed to really address address this shared value issue. It's certainly not a quick fix, but I think the root of it actually also lies in our education system and how we define and support leadership and leadership growth. So for me, it's relooking at leadership as well as relooking at how we can all talk together for common platforms.
Absolutely. Marc, your final thoughts?
A couple of thoughts. And I think, you know, the one thing that's wonderful about shared value is when companies begin with that purpose and begin to say, you know, that's going to be actually driving our strategy and our resource allocation, you know, thinking what's short-term, what's long-term, and we're going to drive this kinds of innovation, those big plunges that we've been talking about. But ultimately, as we talked about, scale is going to be achieved when those innovations are embedded in systems change. And that's one of the hardest final leaps here, because even as we embrace shared value, we still have, in many cases, and it's nuanced, so it's not always right, but we still have the reflex that we're going to do it on our own. And when I hear the wonderful work, and you know, I have to just say, this was extremely modest, because I've walked the hallways, and I was just saying this, this is only that, you know, Barclays London, thinking about shared growth, really needed to look at what was going on in Africa to influence, you know, the entire bank. But the reality is that you've got to, you know, you still have to say, we're not going to do it on our own. And we have this trap of saying we're going to do this shared value on our own, and we get it, and we're going to, you know, and it's not going to happen. And on opportunity youth, on employment, on SMEs, the only way to do this will be to get the 50 or 100 companies to systematically do this together. And so we've got to, again, break out from what we're doing, which is wonderful and that we want to take credit for. We've got to break it out even larger to go to scale and to go to impact. And that systems thinking is absolutely critical. And I think we're going to hear now from Arif exactly how that thinking is being applied also in
Quite appropriately, while we're talking about energy and security, I've got an SMS alert here to top up my units at my flat. So can we please put our hands together for the panel and thank them?
Thank you. Thank you.